"You'll fly stand by," she said, eyes on her phone, thumb tapping out a message I would never read. She said it like one might say, "You'll wait here," or "You'll get the next one," or "You'll understand." She didn't even pause, didn't look up, didn't consider how those words would land in my chest like cold stones dropped into deep water. I stood there in the private terminal with my small suitcase and a cardigan folded neatly over my arm, waiting for something else. An explanation, a smile, even a lie that could make it softer. But Carla, my daughter, had already turned away to adjust her sunglasses and tell the flight assistant how many mimosas to chill. I wasn't on the manifest. The seats were filled. The dog had a seat. The elderly woman did not. "We'll send for you," she said, finally glancing in my direction, the way you glance at someone who has overstayed. "We'll have the assistant arrange something. There's bound to be a seat on one of the shuttles later today." Stand by. As if I were luggage, a loose item, a variable to be negotiated. It was only a moment, but something in me folded then, not from surprise, but from recognition. This was not new. I'm 81. I've seen kindness mistaken for duty and duty mistaken for love. I've watched my reflection vanish from photographs, from dinner tables, from decisions. I've learned to fold myself smaller to fit into their lives. But that morning, in the pristine stillness of the private terminal's lounge, I became aware of how far I had folded, and how small they now expected me to remain. The room was quiet, sterile. No airport buzz, no announcements, just the low hum of air conditioning and the occasional click of a keyboard from behind a frosted glass partition. I was wearing the blouse I'd ironed the night before, pale blue with a tiny white collar, because Carla liked when I made an effort. I had, for her sake. Always for her sake. I'd packed 3 days in advance, called the car service myself, and arrived early. The trip had been planned for weeks. Carla's 50th birthday celebration, a vineyard retreat in Napa, just close friends and family. Her husband's clients, his clients' wives, their impossibly thin daughters in minimalist sandals and hard smiles. I wasn't sure where I fit in, but I was told to come, and so I came. The private jet had 6 seats. I didn't know this until we arrived. One was for Carla, one for her husband, Mark, one for each of their 2 teenage sons, one for Mark's business partner. The last, inexplicably, was for their dog, Oliver, a white puffball who wore sunglasses and had his own carry-on bag. I thought maybe Carla had made a mistake, that perhaps there was a 7th seat or someone was traveling separately. But then I heard her say it, low and quick, to the flight coordinator. "My mother will fly stand by." Not, "My mom is coming separately," or "She's joining us later." Just that, like an afterthought, a variable, a detail. I felt my ears warm. I thought of the last month, the fittings, the group messages I hadn't been included in, the planning calls I overheard from the hallway of the house I helped them buy. I remembered how she'd said, "Oh, don't worry about your suitcase. We'll pack what you need," and how I had repacked it anyway when she wasn't looking. She'd chosen my clothes for the trip. Light pastels, wrinkle-resistant, age-appropriate. I had worn what she chose. I had not asked questions. But now, standing beside a gleaming counter under the gaze of a well-moisturized receptionist, I began to feel something different rise. Not outrage, not confusion, but clarity. The clarity of someone who had finally been told the whole truth, not in words, but in behavior. "You can wait here," Carla said, as if offering me a kindness. "There's tea, and the Wi-Fi is excellent. Just rest. We'll send for you once we've landed and sorted everything. No use stressing." She was smiling, but the smile didn't hold weight. It was the practiced smile she gave to waitstaff, to florists, to anyone she didn't want to bother with but needed to appear decent toward. I nodded. I didn't trust my voice. I sat where she pointed, on a pale leather armchair beside a glass table with stacked magazines and a bowl of individually wrapped mints. I watched her disappear through the gate with the others, laughing at something one of the boys said. No one looked back. Not once. The lounge attendant asked if I needed anything. I asked for water. He brought it in a glass so thin it felt like air. I sipped. I waited. An hour passed. Then 2. I told myself this was temporary, a mix-up, a logistical error they would fix. But I'd seen the flight board. I'd seen them weigh the dog. I'd seen Carla hand over a clipboard and say, "That's everyone." I saw her name every name, and mine was not on the list. By the 3rd hour, I stood up and walked slowly to the wide windows overlooking the runway. Their jet was gone, not parked, not delayed. Gone. The sky where it had been was now just sky again. Blue and white and empty. The lounge attendant came by again. "They've left," I said simply. He blinked. "Oh, I thought..." He trailed off. "I was told someone would be flying standby," he offered. I nodded. "Yes," I said. "That would be me." I sat back down. Took another mint. Fumbled with my phone. No missed calls. No messages. I opened the group thread. Photos from the tarmac. The boys with champagne flutes, surely filled with juice. Carla with Oliver on her lap, sunglasses perfectly perched. The caption? Birthday bound. Love my tribe. No mention of me. For a long time, I didn't move. I stared at the photo, tried to locate myself in it, and then I realized I wasn't missing. I was erased. There is a difference. To be missing is to be expected. To be erased is to be unnecessary. The terminal emptied. The attendant left. A new shift began. The lighting changed. My phone buzzed once. An automated airline alert for a flight to Seattle I'd never booked. I checked my bank account. Opened the savings fund I had quietly kept since Derek passed, the account no one else knew about. I stared at the number. It wasn't much, but it was mine. I looked up. The sky outside had deepened into a soft amber. A jet landed across the runway, the wheels kissing down like a secret. And I knew then I was done waiting. Not just for a plane. Not just for them. I was done waiting for someone to choose me. I stood up, picked up my bag, walked to the front desk and asked the new attendant, a young woman with freckles and no pretense, "Can you help me charter a flight?" She blinked. "Do you know where you're going?" I smiled. Not wide, not dramatic, just enough. "Yes," I said. "Away." I didn't cry. Not there. Not in front of the young woman at the charter desk with her neatly parted hair and headset twisted around one ear. There was something oddly stabilizing about the gentle click of her keyboard, the way she frowned with concentration, the polite tone she used when she asked me to confirm the spelling of my name. I told her. I watched her type it in. My hands didn't tremble. That surprised me. I suppose when the blow is deep enough, when it doesn't shock you, only confirms what you'd already started to believe, your body stops reacting with panic. Instead, it settles. That's what I felt in that moment. Not sadness, not anger, not even shame. Just a final, heavy settling, like a book closing, like the last page turned without ceremony. The woman asked me if I had a destination. I said, Santa Fe. I hadn't thought about Santa Fe in years. But suddenly it came back to me with a quiet sort of urgency, like a scent you forgot you remembered. I once visited there with a friend, Maggie, back when I was in my early 40s, when Carla was still in braces and thought tie-dye was the peak of fashion. I remembered the light there, the stillness, The kind of stillness that makes you listen to your own thoughts and not hate them. It seemed like a good enough place to go. Not for any reason I could explain aloud, but for a feeling that didn't ask permission. The assistant looked it up. There was a flight, a small one. Private but not luxurious. A couple of open seats. Expensive, of course. But I nodded and handed her my card before she could finish reading the total. I didn't flinch. The boarding gate was on the other side of the terminal, through a glass door and a corridor that smelled faintly of citrus and jet fuel. I walked it slowly, not because of my age, but because I was carrying the weight of something invisible. Something that had just shifted inside me and was now rebalancing. The plane was small, white, humming. The pilot, a man in his 60s with a face like dried parchment and eyes the color of ash, nodded as I stepped up. "Flying alone?" he asked, not unkindly. I nodded. "Yes," I said, "but not for the first time." He didn't ask questions. Just helped me up the steps and into a soft leather seat by the window. No champagne, no fanfare, just quiet competence and respect. It was the most I'd been offered all day. As we lifted off, I looked out the window at the receding tarmac, the long stretch of concrete that had held my stillness for hours. Somewhere on that same runway, my daughter's jet had soared away without me, carrying birthday hats and catered snacks and a dog that got more attention than I did. I thought I might feel something sharp then, a stab, a tear, some rupture in my chest, but I didn't. I felt clean, hollow, maybe, but clean. Like something had finally been removed from me that had been rotting quietly for years. I watched the ground fall away, the city turn to grid work, the clouds open like curtains, and I said nothing. I simply existed, and that, in itself, felt like a revolution. We landed in Santa Fe under a bruised sky. The sun was folding in on itself, casting long orange shadows across the asphalt. The airport was small, almost sleepy. There were no crowds, no announcements, no expectations. I stepped off the plane with my carry-on and the same cardigan over my arm, now wrinkled but warm. I didn't call anyone. I didn't check messages. I didn't have any anyway. Of that I was certain. Outside, the air smelled of dust and pine and something else I couldn't name. Maybe a promise I had once made to myself a long time ago and finally remembered. I stood for a moment under the awning, letting the wind catch my hair, letting it tangle without apology. A man offered me a cab. I accepted. He asked for an address. I gave him one I'd found online earlier that afternoon. A modest motel on the outskirts of town, cheap but clean, the kind of place where no one asks why you're alone or how long you plan to stay. The ride was quiet. He played soft jazz on the radio. I looked out the window and watched the desert roll past in slow, dry waves. I didn't speak. I didn't need to. The motel room smelled faintly of bleach and stale air conditioning. The bedspread was patterned with geometric shapes that had lost their edges over years of washing. There was a television bolted to the wall, a chair with a sunken seat, and a small desk pushed under a narrow window. I sat on the edge of the bed and took off my shoes slowly. My feet were swollen from travel, my knees aching from stillness. I didn't undress. I didn't unpack. I simply lay back on the bed, fully clothed, and stared at the ceiling. It was blank, white, a little cracked in one corner, but it was mine for the night. Mine. Later, I stood in front of the bathroom mirror and looked at my face under fluorescent light. There were lines I hadn't noticed before, small ones around the corners of my mouth, a sag to the skin beneath my eyes. I leaned in closer, not to mourn them, just to see them, to study the shape of who I had become. There was something regal about the way my hair curled at the temples, something proud in the way my spine still held itself, even after all the years of stooping. I ran a hand over my cheek. It was warm, still alive. I didn't sleep much. The bed was firm. The night was loud. Pipes groaning, wind whispering through the window pane. But I didn't mind. I wasn't waiting anymore. I wasn't in standby. I had departed, and even if I hadn't arrived at the destination yet, I had left the place that held me small. The next morning, I walked to a diner down the street. It was early, not yet 7 a.m. The place was mostly empty. Just a man in overalls reading a newspaper and a woman behind the counter drying mugs. She looked up as I entered and gave me a smile that reached her eyes. "Coffee?" she asked. I nodded. "Black, please." I sat at the counter. The stool squeaked under me. She poured the coffee without asking anything else. I wrapped my hands around the mug and exhaled. The warmth seeped into my fingers, into my chest. "Traveling?" she asked after a while. I looked up. "In a way," I said. She nodded like she understood. And maybe she did. Some people know how to read the spaces between your words better than the words themselves. I left her a generous tip and stepped back out into the morning. The sun was climbing now, pushing against the clouds with soft fingers. I felt something stir inside me. Something old, but not brittle. It wasn't hope. Not exactly. It was something quieter. Something steadier. Like the feeling of soil between your fingers after a long winter. I turned my face to the sun. It warmed my skin. And I whispered, just loud enough for myself to hear. I wasn't left behind. I left the motel room, had a small balcony overlooking a parking lot where nothing ever happened. A white pickup truck sat motionless for 2 days straight, its windshield covered in a thin film of dust. Across the street was a faded laundromat, and next to it a taco stand that never seemed to open before noon. Each morning, I sat at the tiny plastic table on the balcony, drinking lukewarm coffee from the in-room packet and staring at the world as it stirred itself awake. It was a far cry from the vineyard retreat Carla had chosen. No curated playlists, no wine pairings, no wellness massages overlooking curated rows of grapevines. But there was a strange peace in the emptiness, in the absence of anyone needing me to smile at the right time or stand in the back of a group photo like a decorative lamp. Here, no one cared what I wore, what I said, or whether I said anything at all. I had no role to perform. And yet, as the silence stretched day after day, something inside me began to ache, not from loneliness, but from decades of unspent words pressing against the walls of my ribs like floodwater behind a dam. On the third morning, I walked into town. The air was dry and full of scent. Dirt and sage and faint diesel from a passing delivery truck. My knees hurt with each step, but I welcomed the pain. It reminded me that I was not invisible, not entirely. The body insists on being felt, even when the world has stopped noticing. I passed storefronts with crooked, help wanted signs, murals that were fading but defiant, and a church whose front steps had been worn smooth by time and grief. I paused there, not out of faith, but because my legs needed rest. A woman emerged from the side door holding a broom and a face that had known wind. She didn't speak, just nodded at me, and I nodded back. A silent kind of communion. After a moment, I stood and kept walking. I found the bakery by accident. It was tucked between a locksmith shop and a tax office, its door painted blue, its windows lined with tiny succulents in chipped clay pots. Inside, the air was thick with cinnamon and yeast. A young woman behind the counter smiled at me like I mattered. "You knew?" she asked. I said I was just visiting. "Well," she said, sliding a paper bag toward me, "this one's on the house. First taste is always free." I opened the bag to find a warm scone, crumbly, slightly sweet, the kind of food you eat with both hands and no apology. I said thank you. She shrugged. "We all start over somewhere." I sat outside on the bench and ate every bite, not because I was hungry, but because I had not tasted kindness in so long I had almost forgotten its texture. Back at the motel, I stared at my suitcase. I had only packed for a weekend. 2 dresses, 1 pair of slacks, 3 blouses, and the cardigan I wore the day they left me. There was also a small tin box I hadn't opened in years, tucked deep into the lining beneath my medication bottles. I opened it now. Inside were a few photographs, black and white mostly, my wedding day. Derek smiling in the kitchen with flour on his face. Carla at 8, missing her front teeth. One photo of me in my 20s, standing on a rock beside a lake, hands on hips, hair wild, smile even wilder. I studied that girl for a long time. Tried to remember what she knew that I had forgotten. She looked like someone who didn't ask permission to exist. I folded the photo carefully and slipped it into the inside pocket of my purse. The days blurred, not in sadness, but in unfamiliar calm. I didn't speak to anyone beyond small exchanges. No one checked in on me. No one demanded a thing. I was utterly alone, and it did not crush me. In fact, I began to expand. Slowly, like a lung that had been held in too long. I took longer walks. I went back to the bakery and paid for my scone. I started sitting in the same seat by the window each morning, watching people rush past with their errands and heartbreaks and morning breath. I began to study them, not as a stranger, but as a peer, as someone who had re-entered life after a long absence. I was not ready to call it home, not yet, but I had stepped inside. On the 7th day, I found the flyer. It was pinned to the bulletin board in the bakery, surrounded by handwritten notes, guitar lessons, dog walking, a missing cat named Jasper. The flyer was plain. Room for rent. Quiet house. No drama. Women preferred. $400 per month. Call Joyce. The handwriting was precise. No curls or loops. I took a photo. Back at the motel, I sat with the number for 2 hours before I called. The voice that answered was gravelly and impatient. Yeah? I introduced myself, said I was calling about the room. She asked how old I was. I told her. You clean? She asked. Yes. No boyfriends? Not in a long time. There was a pause. You can come by tomorrow. Bring cash for the first week. If I don't like your face, you'll know. I didn't sleep much that night. It wasn't fear. It was anticipation. The sense that something might be shifting again. Not from outside this time, but from within. I hadn't felt that in years. Not since before Derek died. Not since Carla began managing my life in small, polite increments. I woke early, dressed carefully. Nothing showy, but clean. The cardigan was back on, not because I needed warmth, but because it had become a kind of armor. Joyce's house was small and pale blue, the paint peeling at the corners like a woman who once cared and stopped halfway through. Wind chimes clinked lazily in the breeze. A cat with one ear sat on the porch rail, judging me. Joyce opened the door with a cigarette in one hand and a squint in the other. You the lady? I suppose I am. She stepped aside. Come in then. Let's see if we can tolerate each other. The house smelled like onions and lavender, like someone who cooked real food and didn't fuss over spills. The living room was full of books, a television on mute, and a large chair that looked like it had swallowed people whole. She showed me the room upstairs. It was small. 1 bed, 1 dresser, 1 window. The sunlight poured in like a surprise. I said I'd take it. I handed her the cash. She didn't count it, just nodded. Kitchens shared. Bathroom down the hall. No guests, no noise. Don't touch my wine. We didn't talk much. She made grilled cheese. I cleaned the pan without being asked. The cat, Franklin, as I learned, slept on my feet without permission. That night, I lay in the narrow bed and didn't miss anyone. Not Carla, not the boys, not the house I was supposed to return to. I felt a kind of stillness I hadn't known since before motherhood. In the morning, I applied for a job. The bakery had a sign. Morning shift. Must be reliable. I walked in and spoke to the manager, a woman named Heather with arms like tree trunks and hair that didn't care what you thought. She asked if I had experience. I said, 50 years of making coffee and feeding people who never said thank you. She shrugged. Trial shift tomorrow, 6 a.m. If you're late, you're done. I won't be. And I wasn't. That night, I ironed my last clean blouse, the one with the embroidery I'd once worn to Carla's graduation. It still held its shape. So did I. I slept with my shoes beside the bed, just in case. I didn't set an alarm. I didn't need to. My body woke me. My heart pulled me. And in that moment, between the rising light and the warmth of Franklin on my ankles, I knew I had not been forgotten. I had been freed. Not gracefully, not kindly, but freed nonetheless. The apron was stiff when Heather handed it to me. Forest green, heavy canvas, with a faded logo I couldn't read. She didn't explain anything, just pointed to the coffee urn and muttered instructions. Fill, wipe, smile, but not too much. The counters were sticky from syrup. The air already smelled of burnt toast and old hope, and I knew, even before the first customer walked in, that I would survive this room. Not because it was easy, but because it was real. There was no pretending here. No one cared what college your children went to, or if your husband once ran a firm. The only thing that mattered was if the cups were full and the plates didn't wobble. I hadn't worked in 15 years, but my hands remembered. My spine remembered. Even my feet, though they ached before noon, adjusted to the rhythm of service. I moved slowly, but I didn't falter. I greeted regulars, wiped tables, and smiled at the right moments, not performatively, but with the worn sincerity of someone who has nothing left to prove. By the end of my first shift, Heather grunted, "You'll do," and handed me a cold cinnamon roll wrapped in foil. I took it home like a trophy. Joyce didn't ask how it went. She rarely asked anything directly. She was in the kitchen chopping onions with sunglasses on, and the cat curled under a stool. "There's wine in the fridge," she said, "unless you're still pretending to be a saint." I poured myself a glass and sat at the table without ceremony. My hands were raw from dishwater. My knees pulsed like slow alarms. But I felt something new under the fatigue. A steadiness. A sense that the ground beneath me no longer shifted at someone else's whim. I didn't belong to Carla's itinerary anymore. I belonged to the breakfast crowd, to the old man who liked extra bacon, to the nurse who always left $1 even when she only ordered coffee. That night, I slept deeply for the first time in years, the cat heavy on my hip, the room humming with old wood and soft clocks. On Friday, Heather handed me an envelope. My first paycheck, $74.26. I stared at it longer than necessary, not because it was much, but because it was mine. Every cent earned with hands that had once wiped my daughter's fevered forehead, that had once packed lunches for a husband who never noticed when I stopped saying good morning. I took the check to the bank and cashed it with exact instructions, 10s, 5s, and 1s. The teller raised an eyebrow, probably wondering what kind of old woman needed that many singles. I smiled without explaining. Across the street was a thrift store I hadn't noticed before, its windows crowded with mismatched glassware and out-of-season coats. A handwritten sign promised fall specials, 20% off outerwear. I went in and found a navy wool coat with a subtle herringbone pattern, a lining that whispered of better days, and pockets deep enough to lose the past in. It fit perfectly. When I paid, the girl behind the counter said, "You look sharp." I nodded. "I feel sharp." I wore the coat home even though the air didn't require it. Joyce saw me and smirked. Big spender. I twirled once, slowly, letting the hem sweep around me like a curtain closing on an old play. Only on Fridays. We ate chili from a can and watched the local news with the sound off. Later I sat on the porch with a cup of weak tea and the satisfaction of having chosen something entirely for myself. No one suggested the coat. No one approved it. No one paid for it. I had picked it out, tried it on, handed over the money, and walked out of the store with my chin high and my back straighter than it had been in months. It wasn't just a coat. It was proof. At the cafe, the regulars started remembering my name. One of them, a woman named Marla with too many rings and a voice like sandpaper, told me I had kind eyes. Another said my coffee tasted like his grandmother's, burnt but made with care. Arthur, the man who always ordered just toast and black coffee, began staying longer, folding his newspaper slowly, telling me bits of trivia about birds and weather and his late wife. He didn't flirt. He didn't intrude. He just existed beside me, quietly present in a way that made me feel less like furniture and more like someone with edges. I began to keep a notebook in my purse. Not for poetry or memoirs. I was too tired for all that. Just small things I didn't want to forget. The price of eggs. The name of the woman who always wore purple. The smell of cinnamon that clung to my fingertips even after scrubbing. I didn't write about Carla or the jet or the lounge. Not yet. That part was still soft, still bruised. But I wrote about the scone from the bakery, the click of Franklin's paws on the hallway floor, the way the sun hit the upstairs window at exactly 4:10 p.m. I wrote because I could, because no one would edit me, because I was not required to make anyone else feel comfortable. Joyce began saving the crossword page from the morning paper for me. "You look like someone who finishes what they start," she said. I laughed, but I did finish them. Sometimes it took me all day, but I did. I started taking longer walks on my days off, sometimes down streets I didn't know, just to prove I didn't need a destination to move. Sometimes I stopped by the library and read cookbooks for the sake of the descriptions. I hadn't cooked for anyone in weeks, but the language of food still moved through me like memory. I made notes of things I might make again, one day, if someone came over who didn't expect me to be anyone but myself. It was during one of those walks that I saw the reflection in a window, a woman about my height, same coat, same slow gait. I stopped and looked, really looked, and for the first time in years, I didn't wince. I didn't flinch at the sag in the cheeks or the tilt of the shoulder. I saw someone who had survived something that didn't have a name yet. Someone who had been folded and then, without warning, began to unfold again, inch by careful inch. Not loudly, not dramatically, just enough to breathe deeper. That evening, I returned to the house and found Joyce in the backyard, clipping dead branches from a rose bush that looked like it had given up halfway through blooming. "You look smug," she said without looking up. "Maybe I am," I answered. "Good. That means something's working." I didn't ask what. I didn't need to. I sat on the porch and watched her prune, watched the cat chase shadows, watched the sky turn to honey and ash, and I thought, for the first time in a long time, that I might actually stay. Not just in this house, not just in this town, but in this life I was building, not as a temporary detour, but as a destination. The days that followed settled into a rhythm that was at once unfamiliar and slowly comforting. I was no longer defined by absence but by small presences: morning light, warm scone crumbs, Franklin's uneven purr against my ankle. But then the past reached its long, slow hand back into my life, not with a shout, but with the quiet insistence of guilt disguised as concern. It began with a call from Carla. Her voice clipped, rehearsed, as though each word had been weighed for consequence. She opened with, "Mom, where are you?" as if I was misplaced, like a sock that had slipped behind the dryer, not someone who had chosen her absence. I told her I was in Santa Fe, working and resting, and that I would call again soon. Her response was a soft sigh, followed by, "You're hurting us." The words were thin, like the sound made when someone lets air escape their lungs after holding something inside for too long. She spoke of the boys, how they missed me, how they looked for me at breakfast, how Lily asked if I was okay, and Mark said the trip isn't the same without me. Guilt coiled around my chest like a vine. The next message was a photo. Breakfast at the Vineyard Resort, Carla's hand reaching over a platter of croissants, the boys leaning in with forced smiles, Oliver front and center in the chair beside her, the token of attention again. The caption read, "We love you," but it felt hollow. The weekend had slipped away from me, planned, paid for, orchestrated, without any real attempt to include me. I closed the message without replying. Not because I didn't love them, but because I did, and the love now came with a weight I wasn't ready to carry. I spent the afternoon cleaning the cafe, hands busy with mugs and napkins, sweat cooling on the back of my neck, thinking of ways to answer that guilt without returning to someone else's script. That evening, Joyce caught me in the hall, letter in hand, official and crisp. It was from the bank, a notice that funds were moving, a request to contact them. I knew immediately whose maneuver it was. Carla had tried to direct my money, to tether me still. I folded the letter without opening it and dropped it in the trash. I didn't say anything. Joyce didn't ask. And for the first time, I felt protected in the silence between us. But the tide didn't relent. The next day, I woke to a voicemail from Mark. His voice was formal, polite, but urgent. "Mom, we're worried." "Please call us." Concern dripped from every word. But it felt like a cord, a leash disguised as tenderness. I didn't answer. Instead, I walked to the library during my break and borrowed a guidebook on desert flora. Books don't ask where you are. I marked pages with wildflowers that thrived in drought, plants that bloomed only when nobody else was watching. I studied them by the window, letting their resilience seep into me. I wrote names in my notebook: desert marigold, prickly pear, yucca. They were hard, beautiful, unbreakable. That night, more messages arrived. A text from the family group. "Call us, please." "Everything is okay, just worried." An email from Carla. Formal, tight. "We should talk about care arrangements. It's time my breath caught. Care arrangements. Not visit arrangements, but care." She had decided quietly that I needed to be planned for, monitored, managed, as if I were fragile rather than reawakened, as if my autonomy was optional. I sat with the messages in the tiny kitchen, Joyce working wordlessly at the counter, lighting another cigarette without smoking it, the air around us quiet and solid instead of tense. I let the messages tone out like distant thunder. Then I wrote back to Carla. "I'm fine. I'm alive. I'll call when I'm ready. I didn't send it." I deleted it. I poured 2 glasses of weak tea and slipped outside. The night air was cool, scented with lavender from the small bush under the window. Franklin followed my footsteps across the deck. We both watched the dark sky blooming above us, unfolding without apology. The next morning, I found an envelope slipped under the door. Inside, a ticket, one-way economy class, return scheduled. Carla had booked a flight for me. "Mom, you need to come home." It wasn't a question. It was an order. The paper felt wrong in my hand. Thin, presumptuous. I held it over the trash, hesitated, then tucked it into the notebook beneath the wildflower sketches. I went to work, hands steady, voice calm, but my heart hammered with a realization. The real battle was not against absence, but against being rewritten. In the days that followed, I told Carla I was staying in Santa Fe, staying in my life. The calls came in small waves, an email, texts saying, "Are you okay?" But I refused to respond immediately. I showed up at the cafe every morning, paid rent on time, and filled my notebook with lines of sky and sunlight and small triumphs. I began volunteering at the library on Saturdays, helping shelve books and folding programs for lectures. The librarian, a gentle woman with silver hair and a quiet smile, thanked me. None of this was glamorous. None of it required permission. It just required presence. I realized that care could be mutual. It didn't have to be managed. Then came the letter, a legal one, sent to Joyce's house, addressed to me. Regarding your well-being and arrangements for oversight. It was formal, edged with concern, signed by a law firm none of us knew existed. I read it once, then twice. Joyce watched from the other room. I set the paper down and walked outside to the porch, the evening wind stirring the chimes. I closed my eyes. The letter, the flight ticket, the voicemails, they were all attempts to claim a version of me that no longer existed. They wanted me safe, not free. I inhaled deep, smelled salt and lavender, and stood there until I knew the shape of my own breaths again. Then I gathered everything, messages, tickets, letters, and I burned them in the fire pit behind the house. The flames pulled at paper edges until they curled and turned to ash. I tossed the ashes into the wind with a soft word, not an apology, but an incantation for freedom. They scattered over joists and gravel, half the letters gone before daylight fell. When Carla called again, I didn't answer. Instead, I sent a single text. I am safe. I am alive. Do not send tickets. It was not cruel. It was clear. And in that clarity, I found my power. A week passed. Joyce didn't bring it up. Franklin purred at my feet. The cafe regulars waved. The wildflowers bloomed in the margins of my notes. I realized the second escalation had not diminished me. It had defined me, not by reclaiming what was lost, but by knowing what I would not give up again. The fight wasn't for a seat on a plane or approval at a family table. It was for a seat at my own story. And I stood there, quietly, firmly, in the right to choose it. The morning I walked into the attorney's office, the air outside was crisp with that dry autumn bite that comes when summer finally lets go, and I felt the weight of my coat settle differently on my shoulders, no longer as something borrowed or symbolic, but as mine in every real and material sense. And as I crossed the quiet street with my notebook tucked firmly beneath my arm, I felt no tremor in my step, no flutter of doubt in my chest, because I had already lived the moment of rupture, and what I was walking into now was not a confrontation, but a final sorting of truths, one that would put language and structure to a change that had already happened in my bones. The law office was small, local, with dusty blinds and a front desk cluttered with pens and jars and flyers for neighborhood events, and the woman at reception looked up with that guarded hospitality that all front desk people wear like a uniform, but I gave her my name clearly and sat down without fidgeting, because I knew now what it meant to sit still on my own terms. When my name was called, I rose calmly, followed the man with the soft voice and the ink-stained fingers, to a room lined with file cabinets and faint coffee smell, and when he asked how he could help, I said the words I had practiced silently for 2 nights in a row, lying in bed with Franklin curled into the crook of my legs. I want to draft a will, update my power of attorney, and legally separate my financial and medical authority from my daughter. I said it without apology, without pause, and though he blinked once in surprise, he nodded and began to ask questions. The standard ones, about assets and preferences and next of kin. And with each answer I gave, I felt a little piece of the old silence fall away, crumble into dust behind. Me, no longer mine to carry. I gave Joyce's name as my emergency contact. I listed the bank account I had opened with my cafe paychecks and my emergency fund as my primary assets. I stated clearly that no one was to make medical decisions on my behalf unless I said so in writing. I did not mention Carla by name, not out of spite, but because she no longer occupied the central page of this particular chapter. She was no longer the narrator. That role belonged to me again. The papers took 3 days to prepare, and during that time, I went to work, brewed coffee, wiped tables, walked home with aching joints and clear thoughts, and when the packet arrived, I signed it at the kitchen table while Joyce peeled garlic and muttered about bad landlords, and when it was done, I pressed my thumb to the seal and whispered, "Thank you," not to anyone in the room, but to the version of me who had waited this long, who had stayed alive beneath the weight of being managed and minimized, and who now, finally, was standing in the light of her own damn name. I mailed a copy to Carla, not out of cruelty, but for clarity. No letter, no message, just the papers in an envelope with her address, so that there would be no confusion, no future moment where she could claim she didn't know. I walked to the post office and dropped it in the box myself, feeling the solid thunk as it disappeared into the machinery of distance, and I walked out into the street and didn't look back. That evening, I sat on the porch with a cup of tea, my coat draped over the chair beside me, not worn but kept close like an old friend who needed no explanation. The air was filled with the scent of wood smoke and distant cooking, and Franklin stretched luxuriously beside my foot, blinking with the smug satisfaction of a creature who has never questioned his place in the world. I envied that, a little, but I had also earned my own version of that certainty. The next morning, Heather handed me a raise, $1 an hour, without much fanfare. "You've earned it," she said, wiping her hands on a rag. I nodded, accepted it without embarrassment. I no longer felt ashamed to want something, to be paid for something, to take up space on someone's payroll and someone's floor. I used part of my next check to buy a sturdy pair of walking shoes, ones that didn't hurt my arches, and a second-hand wool hat, deep plum with a tiny feather tucked into the band. I wore it home like a crown. Joyce said nothing when I placed the papers in the drawer in the shared hallway. But later that night, she poured me a second glass of wine without asking and said, "You walk different now." I smiled. That's because I walk for myself. And in that moment, with the television murmuring in the other room and the cat purring in rhythmic assurance, I realized that this, not the plane, not the ticket, not even the flight, was the act that changed everything. Not an escape, not a retreat, but a legal and spiritual declaration of return, not to the past, not to the family that had forgotten how to see me, but to myself, to the woman I had always been before they softened and folded me into roles that were easier to admire than to understand. I was not angry. I was not bitter. I was awake. The days have grown quieter, and in that quiet there is no emptiness, only a fullness that I had forgotten was possible, a fullness of choice, of silence, of simple air moving in and out of lungs that no longer feel heavy with the obligation to see, please. I rise before the sun most mornings, not because anyone demands it, but because I want to feel the first thin light as it slides across the floorboards of my small room. And when I walk down to the cafe in my sturdy shoes and wool hat, I feel as if I am walking inside a life I have stitched together thread by thread, with hands that once trembled with doubt and now move with a steadier kind of certainty. The work is never glamorous, but each cup of coffee poured feels like a stone placed carefully in a wall that is finally mine. And the faces of regulars, the nods of recognition, the muttered thank yous, all of these small acknowledgments build a scaffold that holds me more firmly than any family portrait ever did. Carla has stopped calling every day, and when her name does appear on the screen of my phone, I let it ring without panic, knowing that whatever storm she carries in her voice is hers to bear, not mine, and that I no longer exist as her shadow or her accessory, but as a woman with her own shape, her own time, her own quiet authority. I imagine she tells others that I am stubborn, that I am confused, that I am acting out of spite. But I know better, and so does anyone who has watched me carry plates across a busy floor without dropping a single one, or who has seen me walk into the library with a notebook already open, or who has sat beside me on the bus when I chose to ride to the outskirts just to watch the desert unfold in gold and rust. I have become visible again, and not because someone turned their gaze toward me, but because I turned my gaze back onto myself and did not look away. Sometimes, in the evenings, I write postcards. I do not send them to Carla or Mark. I do not even address them. I simply write them as though they are messages caught in a bottle, intended for any woman who might find herself shrinking at the edge of her family's photograph, her chair pushed a little further back each year, her voice softened until it can no longer break through the clatter of other people's plans. I write lines like, "You are not standby," and "The seat is already yours if you choose to sit in it," and I leave the cards stacked in the drawer, unsent, because maybe they are not meant for others but for me. Reminders written in my own hand that I once chose to rise and walk away, and that I can choose again and again, as often as necessary, until the very last day. Joyce pretends not to notice when I linger on the porch a little longer than usual, when I trace the outline of the mountains against the horizon as though they are old friends. She has her own rhythms, her crossword puzzles, her wine poured just a little too generously, and though we do not speak of love or loyalty, I know she has given me something far rarer: space that does not shrink, a household where I am neither caretaker nor burden, simply a person among other persons, flawed and tolerated and unremarkably alive. It is enough, more than enough. There is talk at the Cafe of Winter coming early this year, of snow dusting the edges of town by November, and I have already decided I will not run from it, but will buy gloves and walk anyway, because the cold will not erase what I have claimed, it will only sharpen it. I will carry my coat, I will press my feet into fresh snow, I will feel the sting of wind against my cheek, and I will remind myself that sensation is proof of being, that even discomfort can be a kind of joy when it is chosen freely. I do not know how long I will stay in Santa Fe. Perhaps a year, perhaps until the very end. But what matters is that when the end does come, it will not find me sitting in a lounge waiting for permission to board, holding my breath for someone else's itinerary. It will find me awake, dressed in a coat I chose, with ink stains on my fingers from crosswords and notes, with flour dust on my sleeves from the cafe, with hair tousled by wind that belongs only to me. It will find me not erased, not diminished, but present, steady, and still carrying the wild smile of that girl by the lake who once stood with her hands on her hips and knew, without being told, that she deserved to take up space in this world. And if one day my granddaughter, Lily, goes looking, if she follows a postcard or a rumor or the faint thread of her own longing, she will find me not as a story told in past tense by others, but as a woman who chose herself when no one else did, and she will see in my face not bitterness, not anger, but the calm knowledge that love must begin in one's own bones before it can mean anything anywhere else. That will be my gift to her, even if it takes years for her to understand it. Until then, I will sit in the sun, sip my tea, stroke Franklin's fur, and know that peace is not what you are given, but what you claim, and that freedom once taken does not ask to be returned.